Los Angeles. A city built on dreams, fame, beauty, money, opportunity. But behind the luxury apartments and flashing cameras, there's another side to Hollywood. One filled with secrets, manipulation, power, and sometimes, violence. In March of 2008, 21-year-old aspiring actress Juliana Redding was found brutally murdered inside her Santa Monica apartment. The crime scene immediately shocked investigators. There were signs of a violent struggle, DNA evidence, fingerprints, a possible timeline. To detectives, it looked like the kind of case that would quickly end with an arrest and conviction. But years later, when the case finally reached trial, the woman accused of Juliana's murder would walk free. And that verdict left behind a question that still haunts true crime followers today. How do you lose a murder case with this much forensic evidence? Was the prosecution certain they had the right suspect? Or did investigators build an entire case around evidence that wasn't as airtight as it first appeared? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of Hollywood's most controversial murder mysteries. A case involving hidden relationships, financial disputes, powerful connections, and forensic evidence that continues to divide opinion to this day. This is the story of Juliana Redding, the Hollywood murder case that DNA couldn't solve. Before Juliana Redding became the center of a controversial murder investigation, she was simply a young woman trying to build a future. Friends described Juliana as energetic, confident, social, and deeply ambitious. At only 21 years old, she had already started building connections in Los Angeles. Like many young people drawn to Hollywood, Juliana hoped to create a successful life in entertainment and modeling. She had the look, the charisma, and according to people who knew her, the determination to stand out. But behind the glamorous image often associated with Los Angeles life, there were also pressures. The entertainment world can be brutally competitive. For many aspiring actresses and models, success often depends on networking, relationships, and the ability to navigate complicated social circles. Juliana moved through those circles with confidence. She attended parties, met influential people, built friendships, and appeared to be enjoying the fast-moving Hollywood lifestyle. But according to later court testimony and media reports, Juliana's life may have become increasingly complicated because of the people surrounding her. Some reports suggested she had connections to wealthy individuals. Others pointed toward tensions involving business disputes connected to people in her orbit. And investigators would later examine whether those relationships may have placed Juliana in dangerous territory. Still, those who loved Juliana remembered something far more personal. They remembered a daughter, a friend, a young woman with plans for the future. Family members reportedly described her as vibrant and independent, someone who could easily light up a room. And in the weeks leading up to her death, there were few outward signs that something terrible was about to happen. At least not publicly. That's one of the reasons this case continues to fascinate people. From the outside, Juliana's life looked exciting, promising, full of opportunity. But investigators would later uncover allegations of hidden conflicts operating beneath the surface. Conflicts involving money, influence, and intimidation. And according to prosecutors, those conflicts may have ultimately placed Juliana directly in the path of violence. But in early 2008, none of that had yet become public. At that point, Juliana was still simply living her life in Santa Monica. Going out, seeing friends, building relationships, and trying to create a future for herself in Los Angeles. Then suddenly, without warning, everything changed. By March of 2008, people close to Juliana began noticing something unusual. She wasn't responding. Calls went unanswered. Messages weren't returned. And for someone described as highly social and active, that immediately raised concern. At first, nobody imagined the truth. But within hours, those concerns would turn into horror. Because inside Juliana Redding's apartment, police were about to discover a crime scene that would launch one of the most controversial murder investigations in modern Hollywood true crime history. March 16, 2008. Santa Monica, California. Concern for Juliana Redding continued growing after friends and family reportedly struggled to contact her. Eventually, authorities were asked to perform a welfare check. At first glance, the apartment complex looked quiet, ordinary. But when officers entered Juliana's apartment, they discovered a horrifying scene. Juliana Redding had been brutally attacked. According to reports from investigators and later court proceedings, she had suffered severe injuries consistent with a violent struggle. The scene inside the apartment suggested panic, chaos, resistance. Detectives reportedly believed Juliana fought desperately to survive. Furniture appeared disturbed. Certain personal belongings were reportedly missing. And investigators immediately began asking a critical question. Was this a robbery? Or something much more personal? In many homicide investigations, detectives initially focus on obvious possibilities. Forced entry, random burglary, domestic violence, known enemies. But according to reports, something about Juliana's apartment quickly stood out to investigators. This didn't fully resemble a typical random break-in. The violence appeared intense, focused, personal. And that immediately changed the direction of the investigation. As forensic teams processed the apartment, investigators began collecting what they believed could become crucial evidence. Fingerprints, DNA samples, personal items. At the time, investigators likely believed modern forensic science would provide answers quickly. After all, DNA evidence has solved countless violent crimes. But in this case, that same evidence would eventually become the center of fierce courtroom debate. As detectives worked through the crime scene, they also began reconstructing Juliana's final known movements. Who had spoken with her recently? Who had visited the apartment? Did Juliana fear anyone? And perhaps most importantly, who benefited from her death? The answers would lead investigators into a world far more complicated than they initially expected. Because the deeper detectives looked into Juliana's life, the more they uncovered connections involving wealthy individuals, business disputes, and allegations of intimidation. The investigation soon expanded beyond a simple homicide case. It became a story involving power, money, influence, and hidden relationships. Meanwhile, media attention surrounding the murder steadily grew. A young Hollywood-connected woman had been found murdered in her apartment. The story naturally attracted public fascination. And as investigators continued piecing together evidence, rumors began spreading. Some speculated the murder may have been connected to personal relationships. Others wondered whether financial motives were involved. But investigators weren't relying on speculation. They believed the forensic evidence would eventually point them toward the truth. And before long, attention shifted toward individuals connected to Juliana through a complicated network of business and personal relationships. One name, in particular, would become central to the case: Dr. Munir Uwaida. And alongside him, a woman named Kelly Sue Park. What investigators allegedly uncovered next would transform the case from a tragic homicide into something that felt almost cinematic. A world of hidden pressure, alleged manipulation, and relationships operating behind closed doors. But investigators quickly noticed something strange. This didn't feel like a random break-in. As detectives dug deeper into Juliana Redding's life, they allegedly uncovered a network of relationships far more complicated than anyone first realized. At the center of that network was Dr. Munir Uwaida, a wealthy physician reportedly connected to business ventures involving people close to Juliana. According to prosecutors and media reports, tensions surrounding financial disputes may have played a significant role in the events leading up to Juliana's death. Investigators allegedly began examining whether disagreements involving money and business pressure created motives for intimidation. And that's where another key figure entered the story: Kelly Sue Park. According to prosecutors, Park allegedly operated as an aggressive enforcer connected to Dr. Uwaida. Court testimony and media reporting later suggested investigators believed Park may have been involved in pressuring or intimidating individuals connected to financial disputes. The allegations painted a disturbing picture. Not random violence, but a situation investigators believed involved escalating pressure behind the scenes. Now importantly, Kelly Sue Park denied involvement in Juliana's murder. And throughout the legal process, the defense strongly challenged the prosecution's theories. But at this stage of the investigation, prosecutors believed they were uncovering motive. And motive matters enormously in homicide investigations, especially in cases where physical evidence alone may not tell the complete story. Investigators reportedly explored whether Juliana became trapped between powerful personalities and dangerous disputes. According to some reports, prosecutors believed tensions connected to money and relationships had intensified in the period leading up to the murder. And they allegedly believed those tensions may have ultimately turned deadly. What made the case especially compelling to the public was how cinematic it sounded. Hollywood. Money. Influence. Powerful individuals. Hidden conflicts. It felt less like a routine criminal case, and more like the plot of a thriller movie. But for investigators, the focus remained on evidence. They needed something concrete. And according to prosecutors, they eventually found it. DNA. Lots of it. According to court records and media coverage, forensic evidence allegedly connected Kelly Sue Park to multiple areas inside Juliana's apartment. Investigators reportedly believed this evidence was incredibly significant, especially because prosecutors argued Park had no legitimate reason to have recent contact with Juliana or her apartment. But the defense would later attack that assumption aggressively. Because forensic evidence, while powerful, is not always simple. DNA transfer can occur in ways many people don't fully understand. And in this case, that complexity would become the foundation of the defense strategy. Still, before the trial ever began, public opinion increasingly leaned toward the idea that investigators had solved the case. After all, prosecutors appeared confident, and media coverage often emphasized the strength of the forensic evidence. But behind the scenes, major legal battles were already beginning. Questions emerged about how the evidence was collected, whether contamination was possible, whether the timeline fully made sense, and whether prosecutors could definitively place the accused at the murder scene during the killing itself. Because despite all the dramatic allegations, one major problem remained. The prosecution still needed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that standard is extremely high, especially in a murder case built heavily around forensic interpretation. As investigators continued building their case, the story only grew darker. According to prosecutors, this wasn't simply a spontaneous act of violence. They allegedly believed it involved planning, pressure, manipulation, and intimidation. But the defense saw things very differently. They argued prosecutors were building a narrative filled with assumptions. And when the case finally reached court, that battle between narrative and evidence would become explosive. Because the DNA evidence that once looked devastating for the prosecution would suddenly become far less certain in the eyes of the jury. And that uncertainty would ultimately change everything. In many murder investigations, DNA evidence is considered one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. It can place suspects at crime scenes, link individuals to victims, and sometimes completely dismantle alibis. That's why the Juliana Redding case initially appeared so strong to prosecutors. According to court testimony and media reports, investigators allegedly discovered Kelly Sue Park's DNA on multiple pieces of evidence connected to the crime scene. This reportedly included areas near Juliana's body, personal belongings, and objects inside the apartment. Perhaps most significantly, prosecutors allegedly claimed Park's DNA was discovered on Juliana's neck. To investigators, that detail appeared especially important, because Juliana had reportedly been strangled. And prosecutors believed the forensic evidence supported their theory that Park had physically attacked her. At first glance, it sounded devastating. The kind of evidence juries often find difficult to ignore. But criminal trials are rarely that simple. Especially when forensic science enters the courtroom. Because DNA evidence does not always tell a complete story by itself. And in this case, the defense focused heavily on creating doubt around how that DNA may have appeared at the scene. One major argument involved the concept of secondary DNA transfer. This refers to situations where DNA may spread indirectly through contact with people or objects. For example, if person A touches an object, and person B later touches that same object, DNA transfer can sometimes occur in unexpected ways. Defense attorneys reportedly argued that prosecutors could not conclusively prove exactly when or how the DNA was deposited. And that distinction mattered enormously. Because finding DNA at a scene is not always identical to proving someone committed murder. The defense also challenged the prosecution's broader narrative. According to defense arguments presented during trial coverage, prosecutors allegedly relied heavily on assumptions and interpretation. And while the DNA evidence appeared suspicious, the defense argued suspicion alone does not equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors would ultimately need to decide. Was the DNA evidence definitive? Or was it being interpreted too aggressively by investigators eager to solve a high-profile case? Meanwhile, prosecutors attempted to strengthen their timeline. According to reports, investigators believed the sequence of events surrounding Juliana's final hours aligned with their theory of the crime. But timelines in criminal investigations can also become vulnerable under scrutiny. Witness memory changes. Phone records require interpretation. And small inconsistencies can create major doubt inside a courtroom. The defense reportedly focused on exactly those weaknesses. At times, the trial reportedly became a battle between competing forensic interpretations. Expert witnesses. Scientific terminology. Complicated explanations of transfer DNA. For jurors without scientific backgrounds, these discussions can become overwhelming. And that creates risk for prosecutors. Because if jurors become confused, reasonable doubt becomes easier to establish. Some legal analysts later suggested the prosecution may have struggled to simplify their forensic arguments in a way jurors fully understood. Others believed the defense successfully reframed the evidence as uncertain rather than definitive. And that shift was critical. Because once certainty disappears in a murder trial, convictions become far more difficult. What made the case especially fascinating to true crime audiences was how emotionally conflicting it felt. On one hand, there appeared to be substantial forensic evidence. On the other hand, there were still unanswered questions. Questions about motive. Questions about timelines. Questions about whether the prosecution could directly place the accused at the exact moment of the murder. And in criminal court, those gaps matter. The defense reportedly emphasized repeatedly that prosecutors carried the burden of proof. Not suspicion. Not possibility. Proof. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued arguing the totality of evidence pointed toward guilt. According to reports, they believed the DNA findings combined with alleged motives and relationship dynamics formed a compelling narrative. But jurors would eventually need to separate narrative from certainty. And that's where the case became incredibly fragile. Because despite all the forensic evidence, there was no confession. No definitive eyewitness. And according to public reporting, aspects of the prosecution's timeline remained open to challenge. As the trial moved forward, media attention intensified. True crime followers closely watched the proceedings. Many believed the evidence appeared overwhelming. Others questioned whether investigators had become too focused on a single theory. And slowly, the case that once looked airtight began showing cracks. The defense pushed aggressively. Expert testimony became increasingly technical. And inside the courtroom, the confidence surrounding the prosecution's case reportedly began to weaken. The central question remained hauntingly simple. How do you explain DNA evidence this significant without convicting someone? The answer would ultimately depend on 12 jurors. And once the trial entered its most dramatic phase, those jurors would face enormous pressure. Because the stakes were now massive. A young woman was dead. The public wanted answers. And the courtroom battle over science, interpretation, and reasonable doubt was reaching its breaking point. By the time the Juliana Redding murder case reached trial, public expectations were enormous. Many people believed the prosecution had assembled a powerful forensic case. And because of the DNA evidence, some assumed conviction was likely. But trials have a way of changing perceptions, especially once evidence faces direct challenge inside a courtroom. As proceedings began, prosecutors laid out their theory. According to reports, they argued Kelly Sue Park was deeply connected to escalating tensions surrounding financial and personal disputes. They also emphasized the forensic evidence allegedly linking Park to the crime scene. To prosecutors, the combination of motive and DNA evidence formed a compelling picture. But the defense immediately pushed back hard. Defense attorneys reportedly attacked weaknesses in the prosecution's timeline. They questioned forensic assumptions. And they argued investigators had built a narrative around interpretation rather than certainty. At times, the courtroom reportedly became intensely emotional. Graphic crime scene details were discussed. Forensic experts explained complicated scientific concepts. And Juliana's family was forced to relive unimaginable pain. Meanwhile, jurors faced the difficult task of processing massive amounts of technical information. This is something many true crime viewers underestimate. Jurors are ordinary people. They are not forensic scientists. They are not homicide detectives. And when trials become highly technical, clarity becomes incredibly important. Some observers later believed the defense successfully created confusion around the DNA evidence. Not necessarily proving innocence, but introducing enough uncertainty to challenge certainty. And legally, that can be enough. Reasonable doubt does not require proving an alternative suspect. It only requires convincing jurors the prosecution has not fully eliminated uncertainty. As expert witnesses testified, competing interpretations of the evidence emerged. Prosecutors allegedly argued the DNA findings strongly supported physical involvement in the murder. The defense argued the evidence could not definitively establish how or when the DNA was transferred. That distinction became one of the most important battlegrounds in the entire trial. Meanwhile, media outlets closely followed developments. The story already contained all the ingredients of a major true crime case. Hollywood connections, wealth and influence, violent murder, forensic evidence, and controversial legal arguments. As the trial continued, public debate intensified. Some people believed prosecutors clearly had the right suspect. Others believed the case demonstrated the danger of over-relying on forensic interpretation. And inside the courtroom, pressure continued building. According to reports, there were moments when the prosecution appeared confident. And moments when the defense seemed to gain momentum. That emotional swing is common in complex criminal trials. But in this case, the stakes felt especially high. Because prosecutors had presented the case as heavily supported by science. If jurors rejected that science, it would represent a devastating blow to the prosecution. And slowly, that possibility became more real. The case that once looked airtight was suddenly collapsing in front of the jury. By closing arguments, both sides reportedly focused intensely on interpretation. Prosecutors urged jurors to view the totality of evidence together. The defense urged them to recognize uncertainty. Then finally, after years of investigation and weeks of courtroom testimony, the fate of the case rested entirely with the jury. Would they convict? Or would reasonable doubt change everything? The answer would shock many people following the trial. In 2013, after years of investigation and intense courtroom proceedings, the jury finally reached a verdict. Kelly Sue Park was acquitted of murder. For many people following the case, the decision came as a shock. Especially because of the prosecution's emphasis on forensic evidence. To some observers, the acquittal felt almost impossible to understand. How could a case involving this much DNA evidence end without a conviction? But others viewed the verdict very differently. Some legal analysts argued the defense had successfully exposed weaknesses in the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Others believed jurors simply could not reach certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. And legally, that standard matters enormously. In criminal court, suspicion is not enough. Even strong suspicion. Jurors must believe guilt has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. And in this case, apparently they did not. Still, public debate surrounding the verdict continued for years. Many true crime followers remained convinced investigators had identified the correct suspect. Others questioned whether the prosecution had overcomplicated the case. And some believed the trial demonstrated how difficult forensic evidence can become once challenged aggressively inside court. Meanwhile, one heartbreaking fact remained unchanged. Juliana Redding was still dead. A 21-year-old woman had lost her life in a brutal homicide. And despite years of legal proceedings, questions still remained. Who truly killed Juliana? Did investigators fail to prove their case? Or did the justice system reach the correct conclusion based on uncertainty within the evidence? To this day, those questions continue dividing public opinion. Because unlike cases with definitive confessions or overwhelming eyewitness testimony, this investigation became trapped in ambiguity. And ambiguity often keeps true crime cases alive for decades. Even now, people continue revisiting the forensic evidence, reanalyzing courtroom arguments, debating whether prosecutors relied too heavily on DNA interpretation, and wondering whether the truth about Juliana's final moments was ever fully uncovered. Was justice served? Or did investigators fail to prove what really happened? That question still lingers over the entire case. And perhaps it always will. Juliana Redding was only 21 years old. She had dreams, ambitions, plans for the future. Friends remembered someone vibrant, social, confident. Someone who believed her life was just beginning. Instead, her story became one of Hollywood's most unsettling murder mysteries. A case filled with forensic evidence, hidden relationships, courtroom battles, and unanswered questions. More than a decade later, people still debate what truly happened inside that Santa Monica apartment. Some believe the evidence pointed clearly toward guilt. Others believe the prosecution failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. And that uncertainty is exactly why the case continues haunting true crime audiences today. Because human beings naturally search for closure. We want answers. We want certainty. We want justice to feel complete. But not every case ends that way. Sometimes investigations leave behind lingering questions. Sometimes juries reject narratives prosecutors believe strongly. And sometimes, the truth becomes buried beneath conflicting interpretations, legal arguments, and uncertainty. But beyond all the courtroom controversy, one reality should never be forgotten. A young woman lost her life. And the people who loved Juliana lost someone they can never replace. That human tragedy remains at the center of this story. No matter what anyone believes about the verdict. No matter how people interpret the evidence. No matter how many theories continue circulating online. Juliana Redding deserved the chance to grow older. To continue building her future. To live the life she imagined for herself. Instead, her name became forever connected to one of Hollywood's most debated homicide cases. And even now, questions still remain. More than a decade later, Juliana Redding's murder still remains one of Hollywood's most unsettling unanswered questions. What do you think happened that night? Let us know in the comments below. And subscribe to Dark Case Files for more true crime documentaries.